So Prof. Emma Tomalin is Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Leeds. She has published widely on the topic of religion and development, which includes some of the following books. In 2013, Religions and Development was published, and in 2015, the Handbook of Religions and Global Development was published. She co-edits the Routledge Research in Religion and Development book series, which now already has 19 volumes. And she is the co-chair of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith in Local Community, the Learning Hub there, on anti-human trafficking and modern slavery. She will be speaking to us today about faith in, well, the title of her presentation is Faith in Leave No One Behind Beyond 2030. Prof. Tomalin, it's a privilege to have you here today. You have got just about 40 minutes for your presentation. You are welcome to share if you would want to share a PowerPoint, and then after that, we will open up the floor for some questions. Once again, if it comes close to your time and it looks like you're almost there, I will make an indication, but please feel free to talk and enlighten us with your presentation this morning. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Brilliant, thank you so much, and good morning everyone. So I'll just get my PowerPoint on the screen. So share screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Can you hear?
Yes, we can, Prof. Thank you so much.
You can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So, so the title of my paper is Faith in Leave No One Behind Beyond 2030. So, in this presentation, I'm interested in examining the slogan from the Sustainable Development Goals, to leave no one behind, and the extent to which it does what it says on the tin. There's something compelling and uniting about the slogan, to leave no one behind. But to what extent does it convey something radical and transformatory, or is it just a clever and manipulative use of language? I am interested in understanding what this slogan actually means against the critique of the SDG framework as a vehicle for the neoliberal development model that is unlikely to adequately address inequality and has ongoing negative implications for climate change. So I'm interested in who is identified as being left behind, who makes that decision, what they're being caught up to, as well as what this says about the types of development that are considered to be desirable. Now, my approach today is less interested in measuring or collating goal performance, or in the technical aspects or realizable nature of the goals, but rather, and this quotation is on the slide, but rather in the kinds of epistemological, hegemonic, or politico-economic assumptions built into them, and the ensuing effectiveness they will have in terms of addressing or perpetuating the historical impoverishment of large groups of people living in poverty. So I'm just wondering if you can also see this thing on my screen, which is slightly annoying me actually. Oh, well, I'll just leave it. So I will begin my presentation by examining the slogan, leave no one behind, in the SDG framework, and the approach of the SDGs more broadly to inclusion and equality. I will argue that to leave no one behind functions as what Leclau and Mouffe have called an empty signifier, and I've explored that in a recent article with my colleague Jörg Haustein. So what they have called an empty signifier that enables different constituencies with quite different approaches to tackling inequality to superficially agree that they are focused on the same outcome. So that's what I'll do in part one. In the second part of my presentation, I will explore the relevance of my approach to deconstructing the politics behind Leave No One Behind, for thinking about the role of faith actors with respect to the SDGs. As with certain types of livelihood that do not fit the neoliberal model, certain types of religion and faith actor are themselves left behind. I will argue that the neoliberal development model that underlies the SDGs does welcome engagement with religion, but as Jones and Peterson have outlined in their now well-known paper, This is instrumental, narrow, and normative. And what we see is a refashioning of religion as a resource to be instrumentalized to serve neoliberal development mechanisms. And then in the third and final part of my presentation, I want to look forward to the post-2030 environment. And I'm really excited that this is a focus of this conference. Or more specifically, I want to focus on the kinds of conversations that we need to be pushing for now in order to prepare for it. So in particular, I'm interested in thinking about how we can get serious consideration of the ways that religion contributes to leaving no one behind in terms of its impact on discrimination and inequality. So that's what I'm going to be covering in my presentation. Right. Okay, so part one, to leave no one behind. Is this a game-changing shift or a catchy rallying call? So Stewart and Salmon write that leaving no one behind means ending extreme poverty in all its forms, reducing inequalities both among individuals, so vertical inequality, but also between groups, so horizontal inequality. So a very comprehensive notion of leaving no one behind. So this is arguably a noble and progressive intention, putting right the failure of the Millennium Development Goals to adequately address inequality as the root cause of poverty. The notion of leaving no one behind also seems to be reflected in the opening up of the SDG consultation process to a far broader cohort of civil society actors than had previously been the case. Although, as I will argue later, this did not go far enough, and they were mostly consulted late in the process after states had made the major decisions. So my main question here is, in terms of being an intention to end extreme poverty by reducing inequality, how successful is the SDG framework likely to be? Now, while inequality was firmly on the agenda in the debates about the successors to the MDGs, Sekiko Fukuda-Parr, and her work is amazing. She's focused a lot on the construction of the SDGs, and I really recommend reading her work. Fukuda-Parr tells us that inequality as a goal was one of the most contested issues in the negotiations over the SDGs. There was controversy over whether it should be a standalone goal or mainstreamed across all the goals, as well as what type of inequality would be addressed. So are we looking at vertical or horizontal inequality? Now, there were two different perspectives on how to approach inequality in the SDG negotiations. One that focused on exclusion or horizontal equality, and another that focused on extreme inequality or vertical inequality. While the focus on horizontal inequality, and this was much more likely to be the view of UN member states, emphasised the need for policies to better include vulnerable and marginal groups in opportunities available to the wider population, without actually challenging why these inequalities existed in the first place. And this included a widening of social services as a continuation of the MDG anti-poverty agenda. The focus on vertical inequality, which we might see as being much more radical, and was in the negotiations was much more likely to be the view of the civil society actors, called for much more radical policies that posed a reform of neoliberal economics. So the civil society consultations promoted a standalone goal for inequality and a broad approach to expressing extreme inequality, social exclusion, and addressing the root causes of poverty, therefore not sacrificing a focus on vertical inequality for horizontal. But other constituencies involved in the consultation pulled in a different direction, namely the high-level panel of eminent persons convened by the Secretary General. This group was co-chaired by the UK Prime Minister David Cameron and opposed a standalone goal on inequality and instead supported the general principle to leave no one behind, ensuring that no person, and this is to quote, regardless of ethnicity, gender, geography, disability, race, or other status, is denied basic economic opportunities and human rights. And in the end, the SDG framework ended up with a two-pronged approach to inequality, reflecting both of these views. So there's a standalone goal, SDG 10, and also this overarching commitment to leave no one behind. but both of these are rather watered down. For instance, the targets and indicators for SDG 10 neglect issues of extreme inequality and the concentration of income and wealth at the top. Foucault-Depart suggests that this was a result of the eventual marginalisation of civil society actors when it came to setting the targets and indicators for SDG 10. Moreover, in examining the mechanisms by which Leave No One Behind made its way onto the SDG agenda, as promoted by the high-level panel, as a proxy for poverty reduction, rather than the more radical goal of challenging the unjust global economic system and ensuing power relations, we again might be doubtful of the capacity of the SDGs to seriously address inequality in ways that make a difference to the lives of marginalised groups. Eloise Weber's critical analysis of the SDG framework suggests that it adopts a neoliberal growth model where there is a deafening silence on redistribution or ecological implications of the continued emphasis that is placed on realising an unqualified conception of economic growth. And she goes on to write, to leave no one behind implies that no one will be, ought to be, outside, excluded from this agenda. This is to say, one could be forgiven for discerning an element of compulsion, suggesting that everyone ought to be part of this project. This project includes a strong commitment to implement contentious policies, which critics have shown to be highly exclusionary and therefore unjust, and therefore also not sustainable. So elsewhere, based on some research, recent research I've been doing with colleagues in India and at the University of Leeds, elsewhere we've argued that groups that do not fit the neoliberal development model, and the particular example I discussed building on this research is the pastoralist communities in Gujarat in India, are not well represented by dominant approaches to leave no one behind. In India, against the backdrop of a particular brand of Hinduized neoliberal politics, economics and culture, I highlight the construction of Hindu and Sufi Muslim pastoralist communities as left behind in terms of a livelihood that is largely invisible to the state, but that's not all. For these communities, catching up means not only shifting to the market economy, but also adopting new styles of religion and culture that exacerbate and reflect existing communal tensions across the country. We find, for instance, an increasing sharpening of divisions between Hindus and Muslims, who previously, as pastoralists, were more connected with a shared livelihood and shared religious sites and practices. With the shift to the neoliberal economy, this is shifting, the sharing of religious identities and practices, this is shifting as both groups adopt styles of religion that are more distinctively Hindu and Muslim, as well as politicised, with poor outcomes for sustainable development. So first, there is some evidence that gender relations are becoming more unequal, with women alienated from traditional livelihoods and religious participation. And second, another important point here is that pastoralist livelihoods are now well recognised from studies to play an important role in nature conservation in semi-arid drylands, although they have been portrayed by the state to be the opposite, with their faith traditions being connected to the land and animals they rely upon. However, the invisibility of pastoralism to the state and the drive to modernise Gujarat through industrialisation means that livelihoods that have great potential for sustainable development are rapidly disappearing. So despite this, as well as the well-known violence towards and discrimination of minority communities in India, supported by the current Hindu nationalist government, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has been heralded as an example of ongoing support for and progress with respect to the SDG agenda and its sentiment to leave no one behind. Prime Minister Modi was already an enthusiastic adopter of the idea of left behind communities and people, even before the SDGs, and made use of this as an election slogan in his successful 2014 bid for power, claiming that no Indian would be left behind, with the post-election development commitment being collective effort, inclusive development, echoing this. Since then, this development slogan has been explicitly aligned with the SDG commitment to leave no one behind. And this then brings me back to the point that I made at the beginning of the presentation in my introduction, that leave no one behind here is serving as an empty signifier. As an empty signifier, it can function as a catchy rallying call employed by advocates of the SDGs, as well as neo-populists on the political right. So that's the first part of my paper, looking at this construction of the concept of leave no one behind within the SDGs and the broad approach of the SDGs to looking at inequality. So in part 2 of my presentation, I want to look at faith actors in the SDGs. Now, it's not just certain livelihoods that have been left behind by the aspirations of the SDG framework and interpretations of it to suit particular national development goals, but also certain types of faith actor and faith expression, at least from the consultation process to develop the goals. My interest in these questions developed during a research project that I co-ran between 2017 and 2019, again with my colleague Jörg Haustein from Cambridge University, called Religion and the Sustainable Development Goals, Keeping Faith in 2030. And it focused on India, Ethiopia and the UK. And we ran a number of workshops, one in each of those countries, plus carried out a number of face-to-face interviews. So in this research, we were interested in the following questions. How were faith actors involved in the consultations to set the goals? And if they were, then who were they? Who was included and who was left behind? And also, how have faith actors been involved in implementing the goals? I'm going to focus a bit more on the first question here rather than the second. Okay, so we were interested in finding out about how consultative the process to select the SDGs had actually been, and whether our research participants had taken part in, and our research participants were faith actors, many who worked for faith-based organisations, but also some who were representatives of faith traditions as well. So we were interested in whether or not our research participants had taken part in the consultation process, and if they had taken part, we wanted to understand more about how they had participated and in what capacity. In all of our workshops, the participants indicated that the awareness of and participation in the SDG consultation process was very low. And this pertained both to global and country level consultations. Most had not even been aware that the consultations were happening. And when they had participated, this was rather incidental and was just based on the kinds of networks they were involved in. They'd not been intentionally invited as faith actors to participate or to present a faith perspective, but instead were there just like any other civil society organisation. On the whole, the negotiation process employed to decide the SDGs just treated faith actors as other civil society actors, with their religious identity making very little notable difference. And as one of our interviewees who was involved in the final negotiations told us, within the NGOs, how visible were the faith groups? I'm asking myself, I honestly couldn't say that they were that visible. That's not to say they weren't there, but I had a much clearer sense of faith community, as it were, from a couple of side events, which I addressed around this time. So he's talking about events that were specifically set up to engage faith actors separate from the main consultation and negotiation process, where faith actors could much more naturally be themselves and express their faith identity. While there was a widespread scepticism amongst our participants as to the novelty of the SDGs and their potential to bring meaningful change to global systems of inequality, there were some distinct benefits mentioned, and some of these are listed here on the slide. These indicated the ways in which our participants were taking up the SDGs and using them to their advantage in strategic ways. So, for instance, in India, many of our participants saw the SDGs as an important tool for religious minorities to engage with state policy, especially as the monitoring requirements for the SDGs forced the state to collect disaggregated data, which they hadn't done before, according to factors such as caste, religion, and gender. Disaggregated data did exist with respect to gender, but it was much less likely to collect this data in the past with respect to dynamics such as caste and religion. Second, given the government's commitment to the SDGs in India and Ethiopia, civil society organisations could more successfully use them as a civil society building tool, a capacity building tool, enabling different groups of faith actors to coalesce around issues and then to present their demands back to the government. And finally, the SDGs were enabling them to link local needs to a global framework that could give legitimacy to their case and help leverage funding. Although the SDGs did not explicitly use religious language and values, participants at our workshops were beginning to work with local faith communities around the SDGs. And it was at this particular interface, working with communities not familiar with global development discourse, that the translation of SDGs into faith-relevant language became salient. And this kind of engagement with faith-based resources to articulate the SDGs was particularly relevant on issues where attitudes were rooted in particular interpretations of religious traditions that might get in the way of promoting, for instance, inequality. So, for instance, around issues to do with gender inequality or interfaith dialogue. So to summarise, the faith actors we spoke to did not have much awareness of local or national consultation processes, or that they could have got involved in them. And the faith actors who were involved in the consultations seemed to be those who were already at the table and were familiar with the development lexicon, which includes not being expressive about religious identity in global development spaces and acting like other secular NGOs. But the extent to which faith actors viewed this as a problem was not uniform across our participants. So in our workshop in the UK, which involved more representatives of global faith-based, international faith-based organisations, some participants there were critical that their involvement as secular actors was evidence of their instrumentalisation by global development actors and their alienation from the SDG process. But then in India, there was quite a different view. Our participants did not see the secular articulation of the SDGs as being problematic. And there was a strong articulation from those participants that the SDGs should be secular. And that made sense because India is a setting where religious conflict and the marginalisation of faith groups is a concern, and secularism or commitment to secularism is an important public value. Okay, so that's the second part of my presentation. So I've looked at the construction of the SDG approach to inequality through the standalone goal and through leave no one behind. I've looked at how faith actors were left behind as faith actors in the processes of negotiating the SDGs. Now I want to look forward to the post-2030 environment. So in the third and final part of my presentation, I want to look forward, as I said, to the post-2030 environment, or more specifically to the kinds of conversations that we need to be pushing for now in order to prepare for it. I mean, I would think, what are we in now, 2021? It's only going to be a few years, I would imagine, before the post-2030 discussions begin in earnest. So I think this is time to really be considering, what kinds of research we need to be doing, what kinds of conversations we need to be having. So in addition to the narrow engagement with faith actors in setting the goals and the SDG agenda, Tadros and Sabatis Wheeler note that religion is mentioned only in passing in the leave no one behind clause in the preamble, as well as in SDG 10.2 on reducing inequalities, which recognises religion as a possible ground for discrimination. So I find it surprising, for instance, that it doesn't get a mention at all in SDG 16, which is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all and build effective, accountable, inclusive institutions at all levels. And I find this surprising when religious inequality and discrimination frequently underpin conflict and violence. So it's likely that the emphasis on religious neutrality and impartiality as an important principle within UN processes can help explain the absence of a more intentional engagement with religion and language around religion, alongside the fact that topics such as religious inequality and freedom of religion and belief are likely to be viewed as too contentious and political to make their way onto the SDG agenda, And indeed, the absence of religion in any of the goals, targets, or indicators, of course, doesn't mean that the SDGs can't play a role in reducing religious inequality and addressing the consequences of this for development and violent conflict. However, for both SDG 10 and 16, we could imagine targets and indicators, for instance, that explicitly facilitate the building and strengthening of interfaith coalitions and commitments to including these in global and local work addressing religious inequality and conflict, but we don't see this. So while bracketing or de-emphasizing faith in the global development arena comes as no great surprise, given its strong commitment to secularism, at the same time, it fails to seriously connect the SDG inequality agenda with religion as a source of exclusion and discrimination. And this has implications for countries where religious inequality is a key factor underpinning social exclusion and leaving people behind. So one question for me at this point is, how do we get serious discussion of religious discrimination and inequality onto the post-2030 agenda? And I'd love to discuss this more, and just to sort of take us to the end of my presentation, I've got a few recommendations. So firstly, given state sensitivities to religious inequality and conflict, it would seem imperative to increase civil society participation in the post-2030 discussions at an early stage, on a wider scale and throughout the whole process, in order that concerns about marginalisation and inequality, including that involving religion as a factor, stand a greater chance of being given a high priority. So to return to my discussion of to leave no one behind as an empty signifier, there is a need to broaden the range of voices that get to decide what this means, what leave no one behind means, and what kinds of demands and concerns it reflects, since at present in the SDG framework and in the power balance as to how the SDGs have been constructed and how they're being implemented, neoliberal state interests have trumped civil society and local voices. Second, the SDGs or their replacement need to be more localised. And the methodology behind securing civil society participation needs to be more intentional and to reach beneath the surface of only involving the usual suspects, and to reach out to distinct cohorts and voices. This is also an issue of building civil society from within local communities, and the need to consult local faith actors in ways that does not filter out their messages or concerns. And third, faith actors need to be consulted as a distinct cohort that can provide key insights into community dynamics, an understanding of important development concepts such as dignity and well-being. And of course, this can't preclude the participation of faith actors who don't represent the liberal consensus. So the fact that faith and the role of faith actors have been left behind in the SDG framework forms part of a broader critique of the secular neoliberal agenda of the global development paradigm. As Weber writes with respect to the use of the phrase "leave no one behind" in the SDGs, it rests on specific ideological premises. It is designed to promote and consolidate a highly contested neoliberal variant of capitalist development. This fails to do justice to the integrity of the very wide range of socioeconomic and cultural systems globally, including tribal, pastoralist and indigenous livelihoods, cultures and traditions, from which people may not want to move away from, and which themselves may hold greater promise for sustainable development than the secular neoliberal model. And moreover, something I haven't really got into yet in this discussion, moreover, as Erin Wilson argues, the dominance of secularism is a form of epistemological injustice, where both alternative non-secular visions of the world and visions of alternative non-secular worlds are subordinated to secular ontologies. So I suggest that in order for the "no one left behind" slogan of the SDGs to actually embody a game-changing shift, rather than just a catchy rallying call, it needs to move beyond the rather explicit assumption that in order to catch up, faith and other identities have to be de-emphasized or even lost altogether as a mark of progress and democracy. that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Tomalin, for a very, very rich presentation. And thank you also from my side to keep within your time. You actually had a lot of time left, but this of course leaves us with the privilege of having a larger conversation. So are you able to stop sharing your screen?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, no, I thought I only had 25 minutes as well, so that must have got. So I was struggling to fit it all in. That must have got transferred to both of us. Right now, I have to. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes, you have. Thank you so much. But
I
I know that
I was not going to manage it.
It's this whole online sharing presentations and everything that all of us had to get used to in very quick time. Some just catches us unaware in different stages. So thank you for doing brilliantly on that. But we are of course happy because we've got a lot of questions, people already raising their hands, and I'm sure we are happy with the extra time as well. So I see Janine has raised her hand first of all, so I'm going to give her a chance as well. If some of you want to add your questions in the chat box, of course, I will be able to read them out periodically, but we've got about just 20 minutes or so for discussion. So Janine, and then I could not see whose name went up first, if it's Deirdre or Spitzek, but let's go with Janine first, please.
Good morning, Professor Tomalin. Beautiful presentation. I love it. I've just really realized, listening to your presentation, that leave no one behind is such a big term. And why I'm saying this is, I'm a hiker and I'm a walker. And I've used that phrase so many times. I leave no one behind. Whether it is urban walking, rural walking, or whether it's in the mountain. This being said, my question is then, how would you address leave no one behind in spirituality as an intervention or intervention tool, bridging inequalities in good health and well-being? And that's a very long question. If I can just pick your brain, answering the question for me, please.
Can you rephrase the question again? Sorry, I didn't.
Okay. So I would like to know, based on what I've just told you, just the bit of background I gave you on the term or the phrase, leave no one behind. How would you address leave no one behind in spirituality as an intervention tool and bridging inequalities in good health and well-being?
Okay, I think I've got your question. I mean, it's really interesting that you raised this idea that this is just a term that we use the whole time, left behind, to leave no one behind. And I've just written a paper actually that will be published soon, looking at some of this material that I've talked about today, but that also sort of traces the genealogy of the term and how we find it in other places. So it's not an invention of the SDGs. And that's often the way with these powerful terms is that they resonate with ways that people have already used language. So they already have a meaning in different contexts. This idea of leave no one behind is, very integral to a lot of religious traditions. So it's a very strong focus of Christianity, for instance. So I think on the one hand, it's a concept that we find within many spiritual traditions that's very integral to the theologies and the teachings and the values. And in that sense, I think it can be very progressive and very inclusive and make a very strong contribution towards interfaith dialogue and interfaith activities. But on the other hand, of course, religion can also act in the opposite direction as well. People can often mean to leave no one behind, or people of faith can often mean to leave no one behind, when what they actually mean is you only won't be left behind if you join our faith tradition, otherwise you will be left behind. So I think there are some really interesting tensions here. And there isn't much written on it. It'd be really great to see people unpack some of this in papers about how faith traditions see this concept of to leave no one behind, that it can both be a welcoming and inclusive approach, but also a very marginalizing approach, because you know, many people of faith strongly believe that their tradition is the only way, and that people won't be left behind, will only not be left behind if they come over and join them. So yeah, really good question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Tomalin. Now, I don't know if Deirdre's hand is still up or not. If it was and you just put it down, you're welcome to pose your question. And then I've already seen other hands going up, and I'll give them a chance. Deirdre, is your hand up or not?
I will go. You can ask the next person. That's fine. I will go a bit later. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, then the next hand I saw up is Spitzig. Please go ahead. Just unmute yourself, please.
Is it me you're asking for, Hans?
Yes, please. I can only see the one name on the screen. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Emma, for the presentation and looking ahead beyond 2030 and leaving no one behind. That's my prayer. The question I want to put is a critical one. Were NGOs successful in the design of the SDGs, and against which criteria? And if they were, I would follow your recommendation to put FBOs or face groups as a separate cluster in the design of the post-2030. And a second question in the same direction is, I'm coming from the ecumenical movement, and in the 70s, there was the idea of making development participatory, to include everybody, or to include more and the people. So now, how is it possible to make that process of consultation within and with the FBOs participatory, to not duplify structures of domination within the religious groups?
Okay. Okay, so were NGOs successful in their design of the SDGs? It's a really interesting question, and there's some really good literature now coming out about the whole process, the whole consultation process. So there was a combination of different interests in terms of deciding, and different groups, what the SDGs were going to look like. So member states were involved, private companies were involved, the private sector was involved, NGOs were involved, ordinary people were involved. I mean, there was an online survey, which I'm sure many of you saw and filled in. So there was a wide consultation, including many more civil society actors, so NGOs and other kinds of actors than had ever been the case before in a United Nations process. And many people think that the kinds of mechanisms and things that shifted to allow that to happen bode very well for the next phase. You know, things have changed, things have shifted, and this can continue into discussing what happens post-2030. The main issue seems to have been that often the civil society actors were consulted very late in the process, didn't necessarily always get their views heard, and that there seems to be evidence that it was the member states' interests that dominated what the SDGs were going to look like. So, you know, there is a standalone goal on inequality, but it's mainly about social welfare and social welfare policies, rather than tackling issues of vertical global inequalities between North and South, and between the rich and poor in particular countries. So, you know, the critique would be that the civil society voices did not get heard strongly enough, and did not have enough of an impact on what the SDGs look like, but then the process of their implementation, for instance. So there is now a process of localizing the SDGs, and there's a project within the United Nations for doing this. But it's interesting if you look at that and the initiatives that have already taken place, the way of localizing SDGs is through local government. So it's another government structure that's being traced down to the local level, and it's not really engaging with civil society groups at all. So, you know, there can be a claim that the SDGs are being localized, but it's still through local government structures and not really through civil society. And yes, I really like your question about participatory development. And I think Leave No One Behind is another incarnation of that really important sentiment or commitment to include local people in deciding what development should look like. What was the second part of your part of the question on that?
Yeah, thank you. The question is, why did it fail, the concept of, where were the limitations of the concept, of the application of the concept? My idea is there is policy design and change of policies. And what we need is change of policies on the ground. And their policy design may be helpful. So what impeded the implementation of the participatory development concept of the World Council of Churches?
Well, I don't know about that particularly, and I mean, it's a really big question, and this is something that advocates of participatory development have been trying to understand for decades. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's perhaps too big a question to try and answer right now, but through not doing what it says it was going to do, through not involving those local voices, so through saying that this is participatory, but that not actually being the case, and the processes and the policies still reflecting Northern interests, and the really powerful structures of the global aid business as well, that pull in the opposite direction of participatory development often.
Thank you so much for the questions and for Prof for your response. We've got quite a few people in the queue to ask questions, so there's a lively debate coming up. I want to give Susanna a first chance, and then I'll read the one question in the chat box, and then I'll give the others a chance. Please, Susanna, go ahead.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Emma, for a wonderful presentation. Hi. Yeah, great to hear your lecture. And I wanted to ask you a question on localization. And yes, it's very important, and it's very important that local faith actors get actually engaged in these processes and these consultations that should happen, as you said, from the beginning of the policy framing process, and also of the implementation process, and not through instrumentalization. Now, I was also thinking of Estela Carpi and what she said about the contextualization of that is as important as localization, meaning that not necessarily local faith actors are the best actors who can engage in certain topics, etc. And so I was just wondering, bearing in mind all these thoughts, do you have positive examples? Have you encountered any examples where local faith actors were actually engaged in a not instrumentalizing way, and in a way that you think is more would be a good way going forward? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I haven't come across anything in with respect to the consultation and negotiation process about the SDGs, but that doesn't mean to say that it didn't exist. So, for instance, I know that there are all the side events happening in New York that were bringing together faith actors. But again, these are the international actors. But all of those discussions happened too late to have an impact on what the SDGs were actually going to look like. So it came a bit late in the day. I mean, we did hear some positive examples of how international faith-based organisations were using their connections with faith actors at the local level to use religious language and religious texts in order to sensitise people to the SDG messages. So that's certainly happening. They're certainly being contextualised now at the local level. But I didn't hear anything about the negotiation process where faith actors really felt that they had. I did hear that the Pope had a strong impact on shaping the discussion, but then he's got a very different, because of the Vatican, he's got a very different conduit to SDG negotiation processes. So I know that I literally know the Pope was on the phone, you know, or his right-hand person, yeah, you know, just discussing this. And that wasn't the case for other faith actors. But also, you know, the Pope has made, you know, through Laudato Si and other initiatives, very, very positive contributions to this arena as well. So he, you know, he's used his position extremely effectively.
Thank you, Susanna, also for that question. So, Prof. Tomalin, I'm just going to read one of the questions from Barbara in the chat box. And she says, thanks for your presentation. She just has one question with regard to the last slide. And she's agreeing with all your points, but is a bit puzzled with the practicality of the last point. How to involve religious communities given the large diversity and sometimes contrasting position of religious leaders and organization. Who to invite and how? If you can just respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, this, of course, is the $6 million question, isn't it? And, you know, it's something I wanted to include because I think it's something that is in the minds of many faith actors, is how can we get more involved in the process going forward. I mean, I think if I sort of look at it in terms of what didn't happen last time is that faith actors weren't consulted at all as faith actors, and there was no particular mechanism that I came across for actively seeking out either international faith-based organisations or local faith actors to be part of the negotiations. So it didn't happen at all, to my knowledge, in the run-up to the SDGs. I think that we would have to use existing relationships and existing mechanisms, and thought would have to be given to that. But, you know, one potential route for doing this is to work with the international faith-based organisations who already do a lot of this mediation work with local faith actors, you know, making the global development lexicon accessible, making sure that local faith actors do get their voices heard, even if this is filtered by the time it ends up being discussed in UN meetings, for instance. So I think there are probably lots of existing mechanisms that we need to look at, and that the international faith-based organisations are already doing a lot of this work and already have a lot of very excellent connections and networks with local faith actors in the global south. So yeah, I think this needs some serious thought, but I'm really interested to see it discussed, and I think this is certainly one of the conversations that we need to be having now in the run up to 2030.
Thank you so much. Also,
thanks,
for posing the
Barbara.
question. So you are facing a lot of challenging questions today. So Tulili, please go ahead. I saw your hand, and then if I have the order correct, at least it's Emmanuel, and then Jörg, and then Deirdre, if we have some time left for all of those. So please, Tulili, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tanya and Prof. I'm going to try and make it very short. One is maybe if one was to start where you have left in terms of the countries in the global south. I think for me, I would like to underscore in your study the fact that when there has been no consultation to the extent in which you have found that it's actually an indictment. It robs the process of legitimacy and relevance. And I think we need to underscore that. And secondly, in the countries in the global south, particularly because I can't speak for India, I can speak for Africa because that's where I'm at. You touch poverty, it's unthinkable that you leave the country that is so devastated in terms of poverty, and then in those discussions. And I think the argument often, Prof, is that who speaks for those who cannot speak for themselves? You might have found that religion actors were not participating, but some countries like your US and others will claim to be Christian in outlook. And so there's a tendency, like you mentioned, the Pope, people coming to the fore and making their voice heard, but being representative of the rest of us who are not part of that process. And so my question, therefore, is how do we then, looking at your recommendations, how do we bring those who are marginalized, who are on the periphery, to actually be partakers in that process, given the fact that already we've actually been left behind? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Again, it's a really tricky question, and I don't have time to say much about it here. And indeed, there's another question in the back here: is whether or not global frameworks can even do that. Are we actually pushing for something that isn't possible within the framework that we're actually talking about? But again, to give the same answer as I gave to Barbara's question, there was very little participation of local communities in the discussions about the SDGs. There was more effort than had been made in the past to engage with civil society. But again, a lot of the local interests and demands were, filtered through the usual civil society actors. So, yeah, I think this is something that we definitely need to be considering.
Thank you so much for the question, Atulile, and Prof, your response. So Emmanuel is next, please, if you can pose your question.
Right. Thank you very much, Prof. I'm in love with your term, leave no one behind. I quickly want to find out, in your approach to leaving no one behind, have you considered the ecosystem in your approach? Are you not leaving behind the ecosystem too?
Yeah, what a wonderful question. What a wonderful question. No, and I think that's something that could definitely be developed along the lines of this argument. Again, is that the SDG framework leaves behind serious consideration of the ecosystem, despite all its commitments to focusing on climate change, water, etc., etc. So no, I haven't, but I think it's something that could be usefully explored within that line of argument.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Prof. I'm
hoping you all could get to say something, because
yes,
a good portion of this is work we've done together. So please let him have a say as well.
Absolutely. He's been patiently waiting in line, so please go ahead.
No worries at all, Emma.
Hi, Jörg.
Hi, how are you? No, I mean, you did wonderful in presenting, and I think I just have a couple of comments really to draw you on a bit more, or perhaps to supplement a couple of places. But and the one thing I think that I would add is that when we're talking about the slogan, leave no one behind, I really like the hiking analogy. Then if you are a strong hiker, you quickly realize that the key to leaving no one behind is to slow down your own steps rather than telling the people to catch up. And I think one thing that we found in our project is that the two-sidedness of the SDG process that the UN holds high and says development is now for everyone, including Western countries, and we've had goals for us, that is absolutely not how it's been implemented in the UK. And I think that came out in our workshops, that came out in our analysis, while we still had DFID, Department for International Development in the UK, those were the ones targeted with the implementation of the SDG. Now it's left in some sort of limbo between the Cabinet Office and different others. But what also struck me, I think, is when we gathered people in the workshop in the UK, the faith-based organizations there were also not quite used to thinking in those terms. It was always about how do we help overseas, rather than how do we mobilize people around development goals here as well to make the world more equitable. And I think there's a rethinking that needs to happen. And the second thing, you know, the UN failures, I think, are very clear, and I think you spelled them out really, really well, in that we just see these state actor involvements despite all of the language. And then if you read our reports, you see it very clearly how, in a very cynical way even, I mean, in Ethiopia, I can say this for sure, the government just says, we have one development plan, we're doing what we want, and we'll just streamline everything into the SDGs, and then building roads is good for women, so therefore that's SDG 5 as well. So you have that going on, and the UN is doing absolutely nothing against it. But I'm wondering, and I'm beginning to wonder, whether there is more of a grassroots movement to be built around the SDGs through religious actors. I'm seeing, we haven't talked in a while, I'm seeing some signs in the UK that that's happening around environmental questions and so on. I don't see it on a large scale, and I have a sense, but that may be because I'm more attuned with the evangelical community's engagement development, that we actually, with the MDGs, we had more of that, with the Micah Challenge, and all of the religious activities that formed around the Millennium Development Goals. And I'm not seeing that happening with the SDGs at this point. So there's also sort of a grassroots mobilization that's missing on behalf of the faith-based organizations in various countries that just, for whatever reason, haven't embraced the UN agenda as much as they did with the Millennium Development Goals, which may be because the program itself is way too ambitious. So those are just a couple of smaller points I wanted to bring in. I wonder if you had comments on that as well.
Yeah, no, we do need to talk, don't we? we will talk soon. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this field. Yeah, no, I mean, that kind of goes back to me struggling to answer Susanna's question a little bit as well. I don't know, I mean, part of me wonders with these successive frameworks, whether or not, you know, like the Micah Challenge was so behind the MDGs, and then the MDGs finished, and you kind of got to start all over again. And I just wonder if maybe I do wonder if maybe the next phase is going to be something slightly different, because surely you can't just go on with this rebranding and remarketing sustainable development ad infinitum. I mean, it makes no sense. So I'm just wondering if there needs to be, and I didn't talk about this today, I hinted at it towards the end, maybe a rethink of what this looks like, and maybe people have switched off because, you know, they are different to the MDGs, but in many ways there's a lot of similarities with all the colourful pictures and slogans and so on, and people have just perhaps switched off. I'm not sure.
I mean, some religious actors have adopted the branding without actually pointing to the SDGs. That's another thing, but yeah, let's talk.
We will. It's been a busy term.
Thank you so much to everyone. It's always wonderful that these conversations always need much longer time and engagement, so that's fantastic. So I want to give Deirdre the last, yes, Deirdre, I did see your hand. I've been looking at it all the time. Don't worry, I won't leave you behind in terms of the theme of this morning. So please, if you're welcome to pose your question, and there's her question, and Prof. Tomalin's response will be the last one of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Prof, also for the presentation. Like all of us, of course, that is why I wanted to speak last, because I have much to say about the SDGs. But in reflection and just in commenting, I just wanted to also point out the first problem that I encounter is calling it the post, the post 2030 agenda that we need to achieve, whereas the SDGs are calling us to achieve these 17 goals by 2030. So the data I'm a bit confused, 2012 or 2015, it has come into play after the Millennium Goals. And then these 17 huge goals, the poverty being one of them, food security, the environmental factors and so forth. And then we need to achieve this by 2030. However, the call came out, right, quite recently for civil society, for private sector, for public sector, which is higher education and so forth, to come into the goal factor, and everybody must pull their weight. But still, and I know that you've mentioned the civil society in your presentation, but the public sector is a huge sector that has been untapped. The private sector is a huge sector that's been untapped, and they are the ones that is, the culprits, if you can put it as such, within the environment. The problem that I encounter is they have this relationship building with the faith-based organizations, particularly, but with the international faith-based organization. It comes to the local faith-based organization, and we call it the grassroots faith-based organization, which has immense issues, but there is no relationship building. And I know some of the people here has mentioned that in order to support those organizations, but the call is out for everybody not to leave behind. My concern is the political driven aspect behind these kind of concepts. It reminds me of the World Council of Churches, the pilgrimage of justice and peace, where we have this beautiful concept, and it can work if we really have the right spirit behind it, but then we allow, or we actually don't mobilize these individual groups and within the context to be able to reach these particularly goals. And this is exactly what I'm reminded of with this UN goals as well. So for me, to bring religion in the sphere is like, let's tick a box. But the box is a correct box because religion needs to come within these discussions, and it's important. But how we're going to do that is not tell the people come together and reach these goals, but let us mobilize those that need to be mobilized. You've mentioned about the program. There has been a call out. About 111 programs has been submitted. It has been accepted. And that was some years ago, and those programs are currently running in addition with government. A huge amount of money has been dispersed from the UN to all the governments. You don't see that money. That money do not filter through the grassroots. But the call for each and everybody to reach these goals, but by 2030. So if you say post 2030, it's problematic. We should say by 2030, so that we could mobilize people and we could put the spirit behind it to reach some of these goals, or at least minimize the problematic areas, untie those red flags and those systems that we put in place to not filter through to the people, and allow for these things to come through to where the problem is actually. That's my comment. Sorry for going on a little bit.
Great comment. Thank you so much. That's a great comment to finish on. I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you so much for that, Deirdre, and for Prof. Tomalin. Just join me in a round of applause for our speakers today, both of them, and also to everyone that participated in the Q&A to make this a really wonderful participatory section and a lively section. So I don't know if there are any administrative remarks at this stage, but I presume we meet each other in just about 25 minutes in the same room again.